Political convergence, economic convergence, technological connectivity. These three revolutions all taking place at the same time, all feeding in. That is what is transforming the world. And it has produced a world with many more countries that are rising and competent economically, much greater awareness of themselves politically, much greater engagement with the world culturally. It's a wonderful thing for most of humanity. You have a situation in which they were locked out of the global system, they are now participating. You have a situation where standards of living are rising everywhere in these non-Western parts of the world. About 450 million people have been taken out of poverty in the last 20 years. That's about as many people as were taken out of poverty in the preceding 100 years. So you have had this extraordinary rise that is ongoing and is likely to continue. You have this technology that everywhere is producing new marvels that are both economic, political, and cultural. Now, does it have challenges? I looked at the theme of your conference, which is, as I say, wonderfully put: transition, disruption, innovation. Are there disruptions? Yes. The single best way to describe the disruption, and it's just a metaphor, is to look at the statistic that worries me most about the United States. So if you look at American recoveries, economic recoveries since World War II, they have a particular pattern. The economy recovers after a recession, some kind of recession crisis. The economy comes back to its pre-crisis level. And then employment comes back to its pre-crisis level. First the economy returns, then employment returns. And that gap from 1948 to 1990 was 6 months on average, but the median and mean were the same. So economy comes back, and 6 months later the jobs come back. The recession of the early 90s, this pattern broke. The economy comes back from the recession of the 1990s, and the jobs come back not 6 months later, but 15 months later. The recession of the early 2000s, economy comes back, and the jobs come back not 6 months later, not 15 months later, but 39 months later. On our current recovery, the economy came back 2 years ago. We are on track for the jobs to come back 67 months later, 5.5 years after. At one level, think about what that means. 2 years ago, we got the economy back to the point it was in 2007, producing the same number of goods and services we were in 2007 with 20 million fewer full-time workers, right? It's astonishing productivity at some level. But that is the challenge and the problem. Because what has happened in the last 2 decades? What has happened since the 1990s? The forces I was just describing to you, right? Technological revolution, globalization revolution. And what are those forces doing to the average American worker, the average Western worker? They are acting like a pincer on that worker, because on the one hand, you can produce goods and services with many, many fewer people than you needed. Think about the 3D manufacturing revolution you heard about, right? Think about how many people do you need on a factory floor now to manufacture stuff if you're going to do it this way. An Intel plant costs about $4 billion to make, takes up about 2 or 3 football fields, is an absolute marvel of manufacturing in the United States today. Do you know how many people it employs? 2,000 people. A Ford Motor Company plant in the 1930s that had a similar output would have employed about 100,000 people, right? So that's the difference. You have on the one hand this extraordinary technological process which is making it easier to do stuff with fewer people, and the second piece of it is you have 500 skilled workers who have entered the global workforce whose wages are 5%, 10% of what an American worker or Western worker's wages are. And they are getting more and more productive. I mean, this is the extraordinary part of the story is really just one of diffusion of knowledge. So when General Motors had to, as part of its bailout, it agreed to open a new plant in Michigan. And that plant was going to produce one of the I think it's the Fusion it's called, or I can't remember the name of the car, sorry. And GM said they would do it, but they had to get a deal from the United Auto Workers to be able to break union prices, that is, break union wages. Union wages are $28 an hour. The union agreed that 50% of this plant could have wages at half that, $14. Sorry, it was $14 an hour, not yeah, exactly. So half that. So it used to be union wages at $28. Now they're $14. But here's the thing. The GM management explained that economically, this was a political thing they did because they had to get the bailout. Economically, the thing they could have done was just make this car in Mexico, because wages there were $7 an hour with the same level of productivity. 10 years ago, Mexican productivity was half or even a third of American in these auto plants. Now it is the same, but at 1/3 the wages, 1/4 the wages sometimes. So that is the other dilemma. You have these two things happening at the same time. And you put countries like the United States and the Western world in this extraordinary period of disruption, where they have very high wages, lots of benefits, and it's a somewhat, I don't want to say over-regulated economy, but economies that have mature in a kind of mature industrial phase, and they're up against these new forces. Now, could we adapt? Could we compete? Of course we could. This is still an extraordinary economy. But you need a political system that is able to move rapidly in an agile fashion, adapt to these changes, perhaps even in an active fashion, anticipate them and respond to them. And that is, I think, the Achilles heel of the American system. We have still the world's most dynamic economy. If you were to ask yourself, does the United States dominate technology today less than it did 30 years ago? The answer would actually be exactly the opposite. I mean, 30 years ago, we were in competition with, Dutch companies and German companies and Japanese companies to make television sets and consumer electronics. In today's cutting-edge world of technology, nothing even comes close. Does the United States face any serious geopolitical challenges? Not really. I mean, it faces problems, but there's nothing, not even China, that comes close to having the portfolio of power the United States has. Does the United States face challenges as a society? We are the only industrialized country that is going to grow demographically. We're the only rich country that is going to grow. We add 3 million people to the population every year, which is why, when you think about the economy and economic recovery, a housing boom is going to take place in America. It's not a question of whether it will happen, it's a question of when it happens, because you can't keep adding 3 million people to the population every year and not give them housing, right? At some point, my theory is based on the very powerful theoretical insight that at some point, children don't want to live with their parents, right? And at that point, you will see a housing boom. If you look at the immigration story, providing new blood to this country. Forget about the debates you're hearing about. Right now, legally, we take in more people than the rest of the world put together, right? So while we have our problems, the biggest problems, are really in places like Japan, where they can't imagine taking in any immigrants. In Europe, where they're actually actively trying to reduce the numbers they're taking in, and the United States, which still takes in more than anywhere else in the world. So that's the picture I see, one of greater integration politically, peace and stability, broadly speaking. Of course, there are terrible places in the world, and we can talk about them. But broadly speaking, no great power competition. Economic dynamism, technological dynamism. It produces enormous competition. It produces enormous challenges. And like any athlete will tell you, you get better with competition. One of the problems the United States has had for the last 20 years, we haven't had too much competition politically, geopolitically, economically, and we've become fat, dumb, and lazy. And the fact that all these countries are now hustling is a good thing. But the key question we have to ask ourselves is, do we have the political capacity to respond to these challenges, to anticipate them, and to reform? I think the debate in Washington is really kind of almost topsy-turvy. The question is not about cutting budgets and things like that. The question is, can we reform? Can we make the kind of reforms that make this economy more competitive? In some cases, that might mean cutting budgets. In many cases, it might mean spending more money. We are at a 35-year low on spending in science, technology, research, and development. We are at a 40-year low in spending on infrastructure as a percentage of GDP. These are deficits that are as important as the deficits that you hear a great deal about. And so the question is, can we achieve those things? So I started by telling you this was a case for optimism. It's a case for qualified optimism. But I still tell you, if you look around the world and you look at the hand that has been dealt to all the countries of the world, I'd still take America's.